The Harper family gatherings were something of a spectacle, large, loud, and always full of life. They were the kind of events where 3 generations crammed into one space, voices overlapping as everyone shared stories and laughter. For me, these get-togethers felt like stepping into a living tapestry of love, history, and occasional chaos. My wife, Serena, had slipped into this world effortlessly after we married. Her charm and natural warmth made her a favorite among my extended family. She'd become as much a part of the Harpers as anyone born into the name, often taking charge of planning these gatherings with the enthusiasm of someone who truly cared. This time, the occasion was a grand celebration. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary. We had rented a sprawling outdoor venue with string lights draped over the trees and tables arranged under a wide-open sky. A live band played classics from their era, and a catered spread ensured no one left hungry. It was the kind of event Serena thrived in, and she had spent weeks pouring her energy into every detail. I admired her for it. Between raising our 2 kids, managing her own career, and now spearheading this event, she seemed tireless. I often joked that her ability to juggle so much was her superpower. The day began with the usual commotion. Relatives arriving from out of town, kids darting around underfoot, and last-minute preparations to make everything perfect. Serena moved through the crowd with ease, greeting guests, organizing final touches, and ensuring the anniversary couple was at the center of attention. I spent most of the afternoon catching up with family I hadn't seen in ages. There were cousins I barely recognized, childhood friends who still felt like brothers, and uncles who loved to share the same stories they'd told 100 times before. At one point, I glanced across the venue and saw Serena standing with my sister, Megan, and a few other relatives, laughing at something one of them had said. Her joy was infectious, and I felt a swell of pride watching her. The evening unfolded perfectly. The speeches were heartfelt, the band played the songs my parents loved, and even the weather cooperated, giving us a cool, breezy night under the stars. As the party wound down, I stood with my father near the fire pit, watching the last of the guests linger over desserts and coffee. Serena was still flitting around, making sure everyone had what they needed, while my mom sat with a group of aunts, reminiscing about their childhood. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt right, the kind of moment you wished you could freeze and hold on to forever. The Harper family's ability to create chaos out of thin air was unmatched, but it was chaos with heart. After the anniversary celebration, the weekend continued with smaller gatherings, brunches, impromptu barbecues, and late-night card games where the family's competitive streak came alive. Serena and I stayed at the guest house on the property with our kids. The space was cozy, with just enough room to feel private while still being close to everyone. Our mornings were spent corralling the kids for breakfast and helping my parents with errands. Serena seemed to enjoy it, her natural energy keeping her in constant motion as she helped organize meals and kept conversations flowing. One of the standout dynamics of these gatherings was the presence of my cousin Teddy and his wife, Elise. He was the type who could make a joke out of anything, yet he had a grounded, dependable side that made him someone you could count on. Elise, meanwhile, was more reserved. Her quiet strength complemented Teddy's boisterous energy, and together, they seemed like the perfect balance. Over the weekend, Teddy and Serena worked closely on planning a scavenger hunt for the kids. It was something my parents had suggested, a nod to the family tradition of treasure hunts from our childhood. Teddy and Serena were both natural leaders, and watching them brainstorm ideas and corral the children was a reminder of how well Serena had integrated into the Harper family. Meanwhile, I spent much of my time with Teddy and the other men in the family, fixing a fence on the property and grilling for the evening barbecue. Conversations ranged from football to work, with Teddy teasing me about my recent obsession with gardening, a hobby Serena had introduced me to during the pandemic. Elise, for her part, seemed quieter than usual. She spent most of her time with the other women, but I noticed she often sat alone, sipping her coffee or scrolling through her phone while the others talked. At one point, I caught her staring off toward the woods, her expression distant. I asked Serena about it later, and she brushed it off, saying Elise was probably just tired from the weekend's activities. Still, the image of her sitting alone stuck with me. On the second evening, after the barbecue, the family gathered around the fire pit for s'mores. Teddy and Serena were leading the charge, handing out marshmallows and keeping the kids entertained with ghost stories. Elise sat beside me, quiet as ever, though she smiled when one of the kids spilled chocolate on Teddy's shirt. "You've got a good one there," I said to her, nodding toward Teddy as he dramatically overreacted to the mess. She glanced at him, her smile fading slightly. "Yeah," she said softly, but there was a note in her voice I couldn't quite place. The night ended with everyone retreating to their respective lodgings, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sense that beneath the laughter and warmth, there were undercurrents of tension I didn't fully understand. The next morning, Teddy and Elise announced they would be leaving earlier than planned. Teddy said something about a work obligation, and Elise stayed silent, letting him do the talking. The following weekend, another family gathering was planned, this time to celebrate my father's birthday. It was a smaller event compared to the anniversary, but still a significant occasion. The Harpers never missed an opportunity to turn a simple gathering into a full-blown celebration. Serena threw herself into the preparations, working alongside my sisters to decorate the backyard and plan the menu. The atmosphere was festive, with balloons tied to trees and the smell of barbecue wafting through the air. Teddy and Elise showed up later than most, their arrival marked by Teddy's usual boisterous energy. He carried a large gift for my father, joking that it weighed as much as a small child. Elise followed a few steps behind, her smile polite but distant. As the party unfolded, I noticed the subtle shifts in dynamics between everyone. Serena and Teddy gravitated toward each other again, their collaboration over last week's scavenger hunt having formed an easy camaraderie. They laughed and joked as they helped serve food, while Elise stayed mostly on the fringes, chatting quietly with my mother and a few others. At one point, Teddy suggested a family trivia game. It was a tradition we'd started years ago, testing each other's knowledge of Harper family history with questions about childhood memories, inside jokes, and old photographs. Serena joined in enthusiastically, her competitive streak on full display as she bantered with Teddy over points. As I watched them, I couldn't deny that they worked well together. But there was something else, something beneath the surface I couldn't quite define. It wasn't jealousy. I trusted Serena, and Teddy was family. Yet the way they seemed to effortlessly fall into sync left me feeling oddly excluded, like an outsider in my own marriage. During the trivia game, Elise excused herself, saying she needed to make a phone call. She walked toward the house, her movements slow and deliberate. I couldn't help but notice how often she seemed to retreat from the group, her presence quieter than ever. Later that evening, as the party began to wind down, my father gave a speech, thanking everyone for coming and sharing a few heartfelt stories from his life. The family gathered around, clapping and cheering, the bond between us palpable. It was in moments like these that I reminded myself of how lucky I was. Serena was by my side, her laughter blending with the sound of my daughters playing nearby. Teddy was telling a joke, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation, while Elise stood off to the side, her expression unreadable. As the night stretched on, I found myself talking to Elise while Teddy and Serena were across the yard with a group of cousins. Elise seemed more relaxed away from the crowd, her usual guarded demeanor softening. She mentioned how much she missed the simpler family gatherings, back when there were fewer people and less pressure to perform. I agreed, sharing memories of smaller birthdays and lazy Sunday afternoons at the old family cabin. It was a quiet, reflective conversation, one that made me realize how much Elise carried beneath her composed exterior. But the calm didn't last. Near the end of the night, as guests began to leave, I walked toward the house to grab something I'd left in the kitchen. On the way, I passed by the side of the yard where the shadows grew darker under the trees. That's when I saw them, Teddy and Serena. They were standing close, their faces illuminated faintly by the glow of the patio lights. It could have been an innocent moment, two people talking at the end of a long day. But there was an intensity to the way they were positioned, a proximity that felt too personal. Before I could process what I was seeing, Serena reached out to touch Teddy's arm, and he leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. I froze, unsure of what to do. My chest tightened, a knot forming in my stomach. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into a fleeting moment. But as I turned back toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something I couldn't ignore. In the days following the party, the uneasy feeling I'd carried since that evening lingered like a shadow. I told myself it was nothing, that I was letting paranoia get the better of me. But the more I tried to shake it off, the more I noticed things about Serena. Small, almost imperceptible changes that were easy to dismiss individually but harder to ignore as they piled up. Serena had always been affectionate. Her touch was familiar, comforting, a reminder of the bond we shared. But lately, there had been a distance between us, a subtle pulling away that I couldn't quite define. She started refusing closeness more often, citing exhaustion or headaches. At first, I didn't question it. She had been busy, juggling work, the kids, and family obligations. But even when she did agree, it felt different. She seemed distracted, going through the motions rather than engaging with the connection we'd always shared. I tried not to take it personally, reminding myself that every relationship had its ups and downs. But there was an emotional gap between us that hadn't been there before, and it left me feeling disconnected and uncertain. One night, as we lay in bed, I reached out to touch her shoulder. She flinched slightly before turning to me with a forced smile. I asked if everything was okay, if there was something on her mind. She assured me she was fine, blaming stress for her mood and saying she just needed some rest. Her words were convincing enough, but her eyes told a different story. Around the same time, Serena began spending more time outside the house. She took on extra errands, volunteered for additional responsibilities at work, and seemed to relish any excuse to stay busy. It wasn't unusual for her to have a packed schedule. She'd always thrived on being productive, but now, it felt like she was avoiding something. One evening, after she said she had a late meeting, I decided to stay up and wait for her. She came home later than expected, her hair slightly tousled and her makeup a little smudged. When I asked about the meeting, she gave me a detailed account of what had happened, her words smooth and confident. But as she spoke, I noticed how her hands fidgeted with her keys, the way she avoided meeting my gaze for too long. It was subtle, but it was there. Then there were the whispers of tension between Serena and Elise. At family gatherings, the two of them used to talk easily, laughing over shared stories and inside jokes. But now, their interactions felt strained, marked by short responses and awkward silences. One afternoon, I found Elise sitting on the porch while Serena was inside. I asked her if everything was all right, and she hesitated before saying she was fine. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she quickly changed the subject. The most telling moment came a few weeks later. Serena and I were planning a rare night out, just the two of us. It was her suggestion, a way to reconnect after weeks of busy schedules. As we got ready, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things would go back to normal, and the distance I'd been feeling would disappear. But during dinner, the conversation felt stilted, like we were two strangers trying to make small talk. She seemed preoccupied, her gaze drifting around the restaurant as if searching for someone. When I reached across the table to take her hand, she pulled back slightly, offering another excuse about being tired. When we got home, I suggested we turn in early, hoping to salvage the evening with some intimacy. She agreed, but the moment felt forced. Her touches lacked the warmth they once had, her movements mechanical and distant. I lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and replaying the night in my head. The Serena I knew, the woman I had built a life with, seemed to be slipping away. One Saturday morning, which began with a domestic routine that seemed comfortably predictable, the kids were sprawled on the couch watching cartoons, and I was sipping coffee while going through emails. Serena moved around the kitchen, assembling a tray of appetizers to bring to my parents' house. She reminded me about the meeting for the upcoming holiday gala, an annual family tradition that brought together every branch of the extended family. This year, my parents had decided to make it grander than ever, with a catered dinner, live music, and an elaborate theme. Serena explained she'd be spending the day helping with the menu, coordinating decorations, and working on the guest list with my mother and a few other relatives. It was the kind of thing Serena excelled at, organizing, charming everyone in the room, and making everything feel seamless. She kissed me goodbye, grabbed the tray of appetizers, and headed out. I didn't think much of it. The day was uneventful. I ran errands, tackled some work from home, and played with the kids. By the time Serena returned that evening, the house was filled with the comforting scent of dinner simmering on the stove. She walked in with her usual flair, carrying a stack of papers and chatting about how much progress they'd made. She described the themes they had discussed, how my mother had vetoed some ideas, and how Aunt Carol insisted on having her famous fruitcake included, even though no one ever touched it. Serena seemed perfectly at ease, but something felt slightly off. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, she excused herself to take a shower. I settled into the couch, flipping through channels but not really watching anything. When she came back downstairs, her hair damp and a towel draped over her shoulders, my eyes immediately fell on her neck. Just below her collarbone, where her tank top strap rested, was a faint reddish mark. At first, I thought it might have been irritation from her necklace or maybe a stray scratch, but as she leaned over to pick up a blanket, the mark became clearer, a small, unmistakable bruise. A hickey. My stomach churned. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. But as Serena sat beside me, her body language seemed different. She tucked her legs under herself and leaned against me, as if nothing had changed. Yet, all I could see was that mark and the growing pit in my stomach. I didn't say anything that night. I couldn't. My mind was racing too fast to form words. The trust we had built, the foundation of our marriage, it all felt suddenly fragile, like it could crumble under the weight of one unanswered question. The day of the grand celebration had arrived, and the entire extended family came together to honor the occasion. The estate was bustling with activity. The large open field behind the house transformed into a magical setting with string lights, tables adorned with flowers, and the aroma of catered delicacies wafting through the air. The event was everything the family had envisioned. Children darted between tables, laughter echoed across the grounds, and the clinking of glasses punctuated the hum of conversation. Serena had been in her element earlier, chatting animatedly with relatives and ensuring the food stations ran smoothly. But as the evening progressed, I realized I hadn't seen her for a while. She was always the social butterfly at these events, flitting between groups with her radiant smile, yet she had vanished. I wandered through the crowd, casually asking a few relatives if they'd seen her. One of my uncles mentioned he thought he'd spotted her heading toward the hut by the lake, a small, rustic cabin the family used for storage and occasional overnight stays. It was only a short walk away, tucked behind a cluster of trees. As I started toward the lake, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. I turned to see Elise, Teddy's wife, catching up with me. Her face was flushed with concern, her dress swishing around her legs as she moved. She asked me if I had seen Teddy, her voice carrying a hint of worry. She explained that she had been looking for him everywhere, but no one seemed to know where he was. I hesitated for a moment before replying, "I'm looking for Serena. Someone said they saw her near the hut by the lake. Maybe Teddy's there too." Elise nodded quickly, and without another word, we walked together toward the small structure. The air grew quieter as we approached, the sounds of the celebration fading behind us. The hut came into view, its windows glowing faintly from the lights left on inside. A sense of unease crept over me, but I pushed it aside. We reached the door, and I hesitated before pushing it open. The interior was dimly lit, the faint smell of cedarwood lingering in the air. At first, it seemed empty, but then we heard muffled voices coming from upstairs. Elise and I exchanged a glance, her expression mirroring my growing dread. Slowly, we climbed the creaky wooden stairs, each step amplifying the pounding of my heart. The voices became clearer, a man's low murmur, a woman's soft laugh. My stomach turned as recognition hit me like a tidal wave. At the top of the stairs, there was a single door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and the scene inside shattered any lingering doubts. Serena was on the bed, her blouse undone, her hair disheveled, and her expression one of uninhibited passion. Teddy was above her, shirtless, his hands gripping her waist as they moved together in a rhythm that left no room for misinterpretation. The room was filled with the unmistakable sounds of passion, their bodies entwined in a betrayal so visceral it stole the air from my lungs. For a moment, time froze. Serena's eyes widened in horror when she noticed us, and Teddy turned his head, his expression shifting from pleasure to shock in an instant. Rage consumed me, blinding and uncontrollable. I lunged at Teddy, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him off the bed. He stumbled, crashing into a small side table as I swung a fist into his jaw. The impact sent him sprawling onto the floor. Serena screamed, pulling the disheveled sheets around her as she tried to intervene. But my fury was too overwhelming to process her protests. Elise stood frozen in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. After a moment, she turned and ran out of the cabin, her sobs fading into the night. Teddy struggled to his feet, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He tried to say something, but I silenced him with another blow, my anger driving every movement. Finally, I stepped back, my chest heaving, my fists clenched. I looked at Serena, who sat on the bed, trembling and crying, her face a mask of guilt and panic. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of the moment. I walked back toward the celebration, the sounds of laughter and music gradually growing louder, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. My fists still ached from the blows I'd landed on Teddy, and my mind replayed the scene in the cabin over and over. As I approached the main gathering, I saw Elise sitting on one of the garden benches near the edge of the celebration. Her shoulders were hunched, her head in her hands as her body shook with silent sobs. Her grief mirrored my own, raw and unrelenting. I hesitated, unsure if I had the strength to offer comfort when I was barely holding myself together. But something in the way she sat there, crumbling under the weight of the betrayal, pushed me forward. Sitting down beside her, I didn't say anything at first. Words felt meaningless in the face of what we had both just endured. After a moment, I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away. Elise lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes red and swollen. "How could they?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. How could they? The people we trusted most, the ones who were supposed to stand by us, had shattered our lives in one reckless, selfish act. We sat there in shared silence for a while, the celebration continuing just a few feet away, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on its outskirts. When Elise's sobs began to quiet, I stood, giving her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "I need a drink," I muttered, more to myself than to her. Elise nodded faintly but didn't respond. I left her on the bench and made my way to the bar. The liquor flowed freely tonight, and I poured myself a generous glass of whiskey, hoping it would dull the edges of my anger and pain. Before I could take a second sip, Serena appeared. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with desperation. She looked like she'd been crying, but I felt no sympathy. She began to apologize, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself. She said it was a mistake, that she hadn't meant for it to happen, that it didn't mean anything. But her words were a blur, meaningless noise in the face of what I had seen. I cut her off, my voice cold and sharp. I told her I didn't want to hear her excuses, that she had ruined everything. Our family, our life, the trust we had built over the years. Her face crumpled, and she reached out as if to touch me, but I stepped back. The sight of her made my anger burn brighter, and I couldn't bear to be near her. Suddenly, the sound of a glass being tapped silenced the crowd. I turned to see Elise standing at the center of the gathering, holding up her champagne flute. Her face was still streaked with tears, but her expression was resolute. Everyone quieted, expecting her to make a toast. The celebratory atmosphere dimmed slightly as they noticed her unsteady demeanor. But instead of raising her glass in honor of the event, Elise began to speak, her voice shaking but loud enough to carry across the crowd. "I can't pretend tonight," she said, her words heavy with emotion. "I won't stand here and raise a glass to a family that's been torn apart." The crowd murmured in confusion, whispers spreading like wildfire. She continued, her voice gaining strength. "While all of you were laughing and dancing, I witnessed something unforgivable. Teddy and Serena, they betrayed us. Right now, As we stand here, the family we've built is breaking because of them. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the festive mood shattering like glass. Heads turned, eyes widening as they processed what Elise had just revealed. Serena's face turned ghostly pale, her hands trembling as she tried to form words. Teddy, who had just rejoined the gathering, froze in place, his expression a mix of guilt and shock. I stood silently, watching as Elise's words reverberated through the group, exposing the betrayal that had been hidden in the shadows. The weight of the moment was suffocating, but there was also a strange sense of relief in seeing the truth laid bare. The once lively celebration fell into stunned silence, the family's world forever changed. The silence that followed Elise's revelation was overwhelming. The crowd stood frozen, expressions shifting from shock to disbelief, their gazes darting between Elise, Serena, and Teddy. Whispers broke the stillness, carrying faint murmurs of judgment and confusion. Serena stood paralyzed, her face pale, her lips trembling as if trying to form words but failing. Teddy looked equally stunned, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He stepped toward Elise, raising his hands in an attempt to calm the situation, but she recoiled, her body rigid with rage. Elise's voice cut through the growing murmurs, raw and filled with betrayal. Her pain was palpable, her words filled with the hurt that Teddy and Serena had caused. As she spoke, Serena's eyes darted toward me, pleading silently for understanding. But I couldn't give her what she sought. I took a step forward, unable to stay silent any longer. The words tumbled out of me, each one a shard of the pain that had been building since the moment I walked into that cabin. I told them what I had seen with my own eyes, every detail laid bare. The crowd reacted instantly, gasps, exclamations, and shaking heads. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, while others stared openly, their expressions a mixture of disappointment and disgust. My parents stood off to the side, their faces stricken, clearly grappling with what they had just heard. Serena finally tried to speak, her voice soft, hesitant, as though hoping to minimize the damage. But her excuses felt hollow, and when she tried to step toward me, I moved back instinctively, creating a gulf between us that felt wider than the room. The gathering dissolved into chaos after that. Elise broke down into tears, her sobs tearing through the tension. Relatives moved to comfort her, their murmured reassurances doing little to soothe her anguish. I left shortly after, the weight of the night pressing on my chest like a stone. The drive home was a blur, my mind replaying every moment, every revelation. The fallout in the days and weeks that followed was as messy as it was inevitable. Teddy and Serena bore the brunt of the family's collective judgment, their actions too blatant to ignore. Teddy's wife filed for divorce immediately, cutting all ties with him and taking their children with her. Serena moved out of our home, renting a small apartment on the other side of town. She reached out multiple times, apologizing, begging for forgiveness, but her words carried no weight. The trust and love we had built over years of marriage had been irreparably shattered. Family gatherings became smaller, quieter, marked by the absence of Serena and Teddy. Some relatives tried to mediate, hoping to salvage relationships, but the damage ran too deep for reconciliation. Others distanced themselves entirely, unwilling to take sides or confront the awkward reality. For me, the process of healing was slow. The betrayal had left a deep wound, but as time passed, I began to piece my life back together. I threw myself into work, focused on my children, and gradually found peace in the routines of everyday life. The betrayal left its scars, but it also brought clarity. I learned to trust my instincts, to value honesty above all else, and to recognize that love, no matter how deep, could not survive without trust.